I've been meaning to own a longbow for quite a while now, but was never particularly keen on the idea of spending £300 to buy one. Then I found somewhere to actually do archery, and discovered that I'm still not keen on the idea of buying one. And so, with absolutely zero experience making bows, and owning almost none of the tools, I decided the best thing to do was to watch a few YouTube videos, and then take a guess at everything else. The first tool is a drawknife, which is used to remove the bulk of the material. I'm making it out of an old spanner, for the excellent reason that it was just lying there on the ground, not being useful. The handles needed to be longer and thinner, so I forged it roughly square, then octagonal, and finally forged them round, which left them at about 10mm diameter. The same was done to the other end, and then the knife part in the middle was flattened out. Once that was done, the handles were bent to an angle that I thought was probably going to be comfortable to use. I don't know if there's a reason that other draw knives are different shapes, but this one looked about right. Once all the forge work was finished, it was quenched, tempered, sharpened, and then some wooden grips were glued on. The second thing that I didn't have was a shaving horse. I did consider using my vise, but I didn't want to risk damaging the wood by holding it in steel jaws, and the position of it wouldn't have been comfortable to work around. Incidentally, I also changed the design about 3 times in the process of making it, which just goes to show that planning things out is for suckers. The 2 tools were then tested on length of cheap pine. The drawknife was in fact able to cut off differing amounts of wood, and the horse did in fact hold things securely. Unfortunately, I didn't find anyone willing to sell me staves of seasoned yew for a reasonable price, so I instead went on eBay and found someone selling 4 laminated staves for £100 and bought those instead. I believe this one is ash, mahogany and maple with a small section of yew for the grip. And thus begins the somewhat nerve-wracking process of shaping the stave into the traditional D section. I decided that the first thing to do would have to be blending out the step, making it easier to carve a smooth taper along the whole length. The grip section had to be dealt with by rasp instead of by drawknife, because the grain of the wood was so knotty and twisted that the knife kept ripping chunks out of it. Thankfully, I did not have to make the rasp. With the bow roughly to shape, I carved some temporary nocks into the ends so that I could start tillering it. A tillering post is probably meant to be a lot nicer than this one, with clamps and pulleys and levers and bells and whistles, but this one is just a bit of wood with a foot to keep it upright, a shelf to hold the bow, and some holes for a pin. After a bit of testing, I decided that the bow's poundage was too high, so I weakened the limb slightly. Once it was getting closer to what I wanted, I started being a lot more careful. The scraper is literally just a small, flat bit of steel, with a sharp, square edge. This piece came from a wood saw. Using a scraper, you can remove very small amounts of material in order to soften the bow in specific places. It's not easy to see, but one of the limbs is stiffer than the other, so some wood was removed from that limb in order to weaken it very slightly. You then repeatedly inspect and then scrape and then inspect and then scrape until the bow's poundage is correct and the limbs bend evenly. Somewhere in this process I made a small mistake and removed too much wood because the bow ended up being about 40 pounds of draw instead of the 50 I was aiming for. Having more or less finished tillering, I moved on to making the nocks for the end of the bow. Traditionally, these are made from horn. I don't particularly like horn. I do, however, quite like bronze. The crucible was charged with lumps of tin and some borax. Both of these melt at a lower temperature than copper or bronze, which helps to transfer the heat via conduction instead of convection. Flux and any other impurities are scraped off the top so that they don't stick to the sand or contaminate the pour, and, once the pour is over, the crucible is returned to the heat. After trimming off the excess, it is then carefully held using soft jaws. I don't think it actually mattered at this point because all of that section is being removed anyway, but better safe than sorry. The first end was reduced down to about 20mm, and then simply flipped around, since this isn't precision lathe work. This time, however, the soft jaws were very important. After it was turned to roughly the right size, I started boring it out, starting with a center drill. I then moved up to a 5mm drill bit, a 10mm drill bit, and finally up to a 15mm drill bit. Now that there is a 15mm hole going all the way through, the bar is now a tube, which is then cut in half, one piece for each end. The ends of the bow were then filed down to 15mm round, so that the tubes would fit over the ends. Incidentally, 15mm isn't an arbitrary choice. The thinnest part of the ends were 15mm. After a lot of finagling to make sure that the two parts fit together closely, 2-part epoxy was used to stick everything together. Once dry, the ends were cut at an angle and filed to make sure the wood was visible inside a ring of bronze. After that, it was shaped to a more organic, pleasing look. The transition from wood to bronze was smoothed out, and then finally knocks were cut into the bronze, while carefully ensuring that all the edges were as round and smooth as possible to make sure that they didn't cut into the string. Once the nocks were shaped and slightly polished, the bow was sanded to 600 grit, cleaned using a tiny bit of acetone, and then rubbed with beeswax. This beeswax was bought for the purposes of making the string, but I don't think the bees care what you use their wax for. There are some much nicer string-making jigs out there, but mine is 2 bits of wood screwed together, because I didn't have one piece long enough, with 2 screws in it the length of the string, which for me was 67 inches, and 2 more screws 8 inches further out than those. We wrap the string around the outside screws, and then use the inside ones to actually braid it. It's important to make sure that all of the string is covered in wax, as the wax helps to bind everything together. The string is made by twisting the strands together one way, and then twisting the bundles together in the opposite direction. Strictly speaking, you don't need to whip the ends. Flemish twist strings are meant to hold themselves together with the stickiness of the wax and the way the twists hold on to each other. I, however, am not that confident in my string-making abilities, so I'm going to whip them anyway. Most people have fancy tools to do the whipping. I have fingers instead. Not as fast or consistent, but cheaper and more readily available. The last bit of this whole affair are the arrows, because what's the point of a bow with no arrows? I've had some titanium rods lying around for a while now, and figured that this would be a fun use for them. The arrow shafts I bought are 11/32 of an inch, so I decided to start turning the titanium down to that. After facing off the end that had a hole for the centre, the compound was set at 30 degrees to give a 60-degree point. I don't actually have a parting off tool. Do not ask me why I don't have a parting off tool. Instead, I use a handsaw. Now that the tips are pointy, it's time to hollow them out, so they actually fit over the ends of the shafts. Starting with a centre drill, I made sure that the hole began in the middle so that the other drill bits wouldn't wander. I then used a 4mm drill bit to set the depth of the hole. I cut the end off of an 8mm drill bit and then ground it to have a 20-degree angle on the tip instead of a regular 135-degree angle. The arrow nocks I bored have a ridge on one side to help you locate the cock feather, so you have to start with that part sticking upwards. The arrow is held in place by something heavy on a bit of string, and this little stick lets you line up the arrow with the marks to locate each of the fletchings. The feathers are held between two strips of aluminium, are roughed up with some sandpaper, and then glued on. The clamp follows the guide slots, and after a few seconds the glue is dry enough to start on the next one. And with that, the bow and arrows are finished. Now I simply have to make sure that they do not in fact explode when you try and use them. It's very important to stretch your bow out to warm it up a little, especially in the cold of winter.